do offer and take POIs. They're an important part of the game and make it more fun for all of us. Without further ado, I'm happy to call upon the Prime Minister.
Hello, can you see me and hear me? Okay, just a few seconds.
I would also encourage everyone to have cameras open if they can.
Firstly, some pieces of setup. Examples of important high-cost research equipment in the status quo include things like GPUs that are necessary for training large language models and artificial intelligence, things like mechanical arms, which are crucial for like biology or mechanics, things like chemicals or sort of equipment that is necessary to deal with rare chemicals that is often inaccessible to people on the ground. Access to these equipments on our side of the house will be determined based on a series of things. These are likely to be due to the governmental incentives of these institutions. First of all, the qualification of the researcher, the extent to which they're likely to successfully carry out that research. Second of all, the utility of the research direction. We would note that on both sides of the house, governments probably control funding to some extent to research institutions. So they have similar criteria for utility on both sides. Also because the humanities subjects usually do not require significant high-cost equipment for research. This is mostly a debate about STEM subjects. Third of all, diversity concerns, which broadly also exist in other forms on the counterfactual. So you would likely not just fund one big institution, but also care about accessibility to general researchers. Third of all, access is usually granted for a fixed period of time for stated purposes. You're likely required to file reports to the government on whether or not you're carrying out this research successfully and whether you have obtained some level of progress. Fourth of all, the production of these high-cost equipment are still likely to exist on both sides because the state obviously will purchase these forms of equipment and the state will likely subsidize their production to some extent. If some high-cost research equipment is also difficult to produce, then companies will still have an incentive to produce it, first of all, because even if there is a cost of innovating to produce that technology in the short run, and you have to put in a lot of research and development costs, developing that technology gives you sort of an edge over other companies due to the first mover advantage. So companies are still willing to produce it. Secondly, the state can subsidize the production of these equipments. For instance, if you're the first person to come up with the techniques necessary to produce a certain research equipment, then you will receive a certain grant from the state. So there are various incentives for companies to produce these high-cost research equipments on both sides. Finally, on their side of the house, corporations in the status quo often engage in research. So it's things like Google Brain, which is a department of Google, which engages in research exclusively for the purposes of Google. These institutions are also like research centers. So in order for them to get access to that research equipment, they must also get approval from these agencies. Given that, two arguments in the speech. First of all, inequality. Second of all, on corporations. Before that, any clarifications? Okay, first of all, inequality. I would note that in the status quo, under the model of governments and corporate sponsors giving institutional funding to people who engage in research, there is massive inequality within academia. And small institutions often do not have the funding necessary to purchase research equipment. This is for 4 different reasons. Number one, access to equipment is often based on connections to things like governments and patronage networks. On their side of the house, you have much more ability to just be connected to important people within an institution and therefore be able to access certain forms of equipment. It is uniquely on our side that one institution is taking care of this in a highly standardized manner, in a manner that's very difficult for any external intervention to occur in. Second of all, often the amount of research equipment you're able to access is based on how well-funded your university is, because your department's funding usually comes from the university. So if you're a small institution, you often don't have the money to purchase lots of GPUs. Third of all, it's often based on whether you have corporate sponsorship. So if you're a small institution who big companies are unlikely to trust because obviously they have various alternatives like investing in big institutions, you're unlikely to get that money to purchase equipment. And fourth of all, equipment is often selectively accessible to certain institutions. This might be because your institution is more prestigious and has better connections to producers of certain equipments like GPUs. This might be because your institution is bigger, and therefore you want a larger number of them. And due to things like the economies of scale, companies are much more willing to sell to you at a lower price than selling to smaller institutions, because they have to do things like maintenance of these equipment on both sides if they only want to sell to bigger actors, because it also depends on many things, like the sort of quality of companies you're able to access based on your nationality, based on your affiliations, etc. Whereas, and the impact of all of this is that good researchers also leave smaller institutions because they have no because these smaller institutions have less access to these forms of equipment, have worse research, less publishing, and worse reputation. So this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where smaller institutions grow gradually smaller and produce worse research. Yes, CEO.
If I'm the US, don't I want all my, not all, but a lot of my MRIs, microscopes, et cetera, to be located in, say, the Bay Area, where a lot of the highest quality researchers are, and institutions with the ability to fund projects using those things on either side of the house are actually centralized?
Yeah, so this is what I will get into right now. Why is research being concentrated in a few areas or a small number of big labs a really bad thing? I have 5 structural reasons. The first reason is that this means there's less need for competition because no other labs are able to compete with you, and so there's less need to be productive and innovation becomes slower. Second of all, many talented researchers are just unable to access these institutions because of proximity reasons, because they're located far away and there are limited slots for enrollment. So talent is often highly arbitrary in research, but very important. When all people in all institutions have some access to research equipment, you're much more likely to get some talented mind that can produce impressive results. Third of all, there are fewer students who engage in academia on their side because at the point where research equipment is concentrated in a few institutions, there is intense pressure to enter into a small number of good labs, and therefore it becomes much harder to engage in actually good research within this industry. And so this produces a strong incentive for students not to do this in the first place because of the high level of competition to enter into that lab. Fourth of all, there's often a single or unified perspective within a single lab or a single institution, which means that you don't explore in various directions because of your philosophy. So that often locks out many different valuable perspectives that might be important in the field. And finally, crucially, on their side, there's a lack of transparency because it's unclear if many of the decisions made by a certain lab are morally good. And on their side, crucially, other labs aren't able to challenge the decisions made by these small number of big labs because they don't have the similar level of expertise. They don't even have access to what they're doing. And so there's much less transparency on their side. Finally, on corporations, there are 2 things to note here. First of all, on their side, where institutions rely on corporate sponsorship, this is terrible because corporate sponsorship influences the direction of academia. It means that these companies will shut down research that criticizes their products, and this means that there's less academic integrity and more profit-driven incentives. But second of all, this causes the decline of academia because at the point where on their side, corporations have their own research departments, these research departments obviously have substantially more funding than universities, and therefore, like Google and OpenAI can buy 1 million GPUs, whereas even the best Ivy League institutions don't get access to lots of GPUs. Because corporations have more money than researchers, corporations are much more powerful than academia. And this is bad because companies, due to their profit-driven nature, are much less willing to share the outcome of their research as opposed to academia, which has a culture of open source. Companies are more profit-driven and less likely to explore areas simply for the sake of it. For all of these reasons, very happy to propose.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister, and I'm happy to call upon the Leader of the Opposition.
Okay, I hope that I'm audible. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. First of all, few pieces of framing. Firstly, what criteria does this agency base on? Probably they will trust this equipment based on experience, quality, and like the ranking of the researchers. Probably the equipment will go to the most high professors that have like huge research experience, etc., etc. Note that these things are similar on our side of the house, and then I will explain this later and explain why quality still exists on our side of the house. But secondly, note that this creates bureaucracy because you have to be more accountable. You have to sign more papers because you don't own these labs as you do in universities. You have to borrow them from a state, meaning that you have to sign huge amounts of paper, control, etc., to show that you are doing the right thing with these labs, etc., etc. This takes longer time because from when you get, because you stay in queue, you show that you're accountable, etc., etc. You go past thousands of interviews for this, and you go from thousands of queues, etc. So this will take much longer time to do this research. But moreover, know that you can't give all this equipment give out all this equipment at the same time, because it gets much harder to control all of them, and like, well, watch out for everybody and check whether they are doing correct thing or not. So I will link this later. But thirdly, what are these equipments? As we agree with OG, this is most likely about like labs, etc. It's not about social science or humanities. It's mostly about STEM and technologies. So firstly, why quality still exists on our side of the house? We believe that the most responsible people will take these equipments, aka highest grade profs, etc., who are on our side of the house. So the highest equipment still goes to the highest grade profs as it is on the government side of the house. So it relatively stays the same, and these profs probably have an incentive for like competitive incentive to do these things, because they have to constantly publish to stay relevant to the academia and still have their authority in the academia, to have like to have investments on the researchers, etc., because the way professors get money is they have their money from like the grants that they have, the investments that they have on the research. So probably if they have more of it, if they like publish constantly and publish quality researches, they get more money, so they have like their interest to do these things like with quality as it is on the side of the house of the government as well. But know that institutions get investments and the authority for this. So probably people base their rank the institutions based on the research capabilities and their quality of the research. There are rankings based on research, based of research universities based on the research quality. So know that this all means that on academic level, the quality is still symmetrical. And on companies like British American Tobacco or that make bad researches, they are still trusted less, because people still trust institutions like the university more, because they have authority. Most people been in the university, and they know that they can trust these companies. On the other side of the house, probably they know that British American Tobacco is not a good thing, or is not the like most trustful company in the world. But know that these companies still have a huge lobby power, so probably they will still be able to get this equipment on the government side of the house. So it's relatively stays the same. But if prop will somehow manage to prove that people still trust these bad companies, they don't need huge equipment for that, to prove that their tobacco is not that bad. Because if people already trust them, then probably without high improvement, people will just trust them based on because they already have some biases, etc. So even if they like people trust them, they don't need high research equipments to like do this. It is waste of money for them. But secondly, why there will be less investment on the government side of the house? So first of all, we have to understand why these companies are like private investors invest in researchers. Know that researchers get private investors need high returns and the fast returns getting them. And why this will be less on the government side of the house? If there is a bureaucracy, then probably you have a less chance to get these returns faster, because this now takes much longer time and much higher control, etc. So probably if it constantly takes longer time, then probably investor will invest in some other thing that will take less time. So because they have a huge pool of things that they can invest in. So probably this means that because of this, there will be less research, less investments in research. But know that government gets percentage of for the equipment, or at least gets some stake on gets some of the money given by the that is making by the equipment. So probably investors get less return in terms of money. So probably there are less incentives to invest in that. Why investment is important here? Firstly, it is money for like equipment other than like these technologies. It is your research assistants, it is your interviews, etc. It is your like go aways to other cities, etc. So probably hugely affects the amount of quality, because if you have more assistants helping you, probably you have more quality because you have more people to test something. But secondly, about diversity, less investment means less areas in which technologies are used or technologies are invested to. It means that less chances that technology will get to diverse group of people, so people left out without this. But thirdly, note that the research idea becomes less attractive, and because and people have less incentive to do this because people get less investments on that. But thirdly, lastly, why research quality in long term will get worse on the government side of the house? Note that institutions are less likely to focus on research now because they don't raise researches that will further improve the authority of the university, because the researchers do not belong to universities anymore, meaning that probably there is no interest for the institutions like universities, etc. So less research focus. Probably they will change their focus to making studies more practical, etc., etc. So probably people will be not built into the research area, etc. But less people are likely to go. Firstly, because in status quo it is very easy. Yes, because you get PhD, you know everybody. It's easier to work there. You know every person there, and it is easier to go there. Now you don't have you don't stay in your university. You should get the equipment from other side. Yeah. But secondly, know that young researchers will get less chances to work there because agency will not risk and give equipment to those who already know how to work with them, and young researchers will not be able to work in this area. So probably they will choose another job. So yeah, I'm proud.
Thank you very much to the leader of the opposition, and I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
First, closing government are out of this debate. This is not just a debate about the Large Hadron Collider. Reason one, the Large Hadron Collider is not currently owned by a collection of universities. Closing government doesn't know the answer to their own fucking POI. It is produced and owned by CERN, which is an intergovernmental organization. It costs $5 billion to produce plus $1 billion to run each year. Governments are overwhelmingly likely to have the only resources to fund such an institution. CERN comprises 23 member states, 22 European ones and Israel, that threw in shit tons of funding in order to produce and own the Large Hadron Collider. This means nationalization is symmetric. Second, they say all other technologies that don't cost $5 billion are cheap. What the fuck? Your choice is not between $5 billion and cheap. $500,000 for an advanced fMRI machine is a massive cost to research labs and smaller universities. Microscopes aren't cheap. Max isn't talking about a microscope that costs $20 that you bought in a fucking toy store. Closing government is the hard fourth. Now let's engage in the actual debate. Opening government says research being concentrated in a small number of big labs is a bad thing. There's less competition and slower innovation, while talented researchers are unable to access them. As opening opposition points out, and I'm going to expand now, this argument from OG is not comparative. On your side, governments will continue to have strong incentives to give favorable terms to large labs. Even the selection of large labs, BPM claims, do relatively unproductive research. Why? Regulatory capture of the government agency. There are two ways this happens. One, there is a revolving door of government employees. If government agencies want to have researchers in them who can actually understand and evaluate the research that is being done, many times these will be people either previously hired out of the private sector or people who are using a government job to get better prospects in the extremely well-resourced private sector whose budget and resources are not spread too thin, so they are willing to give extremely high salaries. This creates a revolving door where private companies routinely hire out of regulatory agencies. This creates a preemptive incentive among the regulators themselves to realize they will often, 5 years down the line, have employment in a private sector company. You can't regulate against this because that would cause massive brain drain that weakens your regulatory agency. This in turn means they're likely to give favorable terms to labs that are relatively good, especially if you're using an independent panel of existing experts who are not full-time employees of your governments. Second, lobbying. Opening opposition says the word lobbying without making the argument. As opening government points out, large labs have connections with corporations. If corporations care intensely about accessing equipment, they pressure governments to appoint individuals to this agency who favor them, and they have the ability to because they can make massive donations to political parties. Critically, this beats opening government's claim that voters will be a good accountability mechanism to ensure socially valuable research is prioritized. Two reasons they will not. One, research is inherently long-term. The benefits of research will happen 10, 15 years down the line after you've invested substantial amounts of funding into them. At that point, the current political party might not even be in power. Short-term election cycles means long-term research is inherently not prioritized by political parties compared to immediate gains like campaign donations that a corporation can give them. But second, research is technical and hard to understand. So if academics write op-eds in newspapers like The Atlantic, people aren't often reading those op-eds. And also, these academics often want to be hired by the corporation, so they won't write an op-ed criticizing it. There's very little accountability here, meaning OG's model of independent experts will inherently be corrupted by regulatory capture, so OG's margin is small. Two areas of extension then. One, this increases the inaccessibility of research equipment because this reduces incentives to build the equipment in the first place. This argument has a couple of logical steps. One, the costs of high-cost research equipment are going down over time. A number of structural reasons. One, Moore's law. The number of transistors in an integrated circuit doubles every 2 years. High-tech equipment needs the ability to hold and access data. One of the largest supply chain barriers is high computing power through semiconductors. This is one of the largest drivers of high cost of everything from MRI machines and telescopes to particle accelerators. But empirically, semiconductor prices are reducing, and the ordinary informed voter knows this as this is major national news. There are also good logical reasons for this, which is as institutions like AI develop, semiconductor markets become more and more attractive, which throws investment into them and makes semiconductors cheaper. Second, there is increasing discovery of rare earth minerals. Contrary to their name, rare earth minerals are not in fact that rare. They are plentiful in Earth's crust. The problem is contamination as well as how deep they are to access. In both these cases, as upsides to research rises, there is more investment to make semiconductor prices go down and mine more rare earth minerals. But third, competition among firms rises. High-cost research equipment starts off with a few firms who enter the market, at which point it's monopolistic. But as more firms see the upside, they enter the market themselves. This competition in turn drives down the prices of research equipment and makes it accessible in the long run. Second step of this argument, this substantially reduces accessibility to research equipment. Why? Because it substantially depresses the incentive to produce this equipment. Critically, the government is not charging a meaningful amount for this equipment by OG's own argument. If you want to say it's cheaper for labs to access this equipment, that means the government isn't charging you a meaningful amount of money. This undercuts OG's claim that governments will simply subsidize and labs get a substantial first mover advantage. Government research budgets are small, both because research is long term and governments are spread very thin in what they are funding. What this means is they don't have a shit ton of money to throw into subsidies. However, they're not getting money out of this either. What this means is they pressure firms that produce this equipment to pay them very low costs at the point where the government is the sole buyer and hence has tons of negotiating power over anyone who's producing this equipment. What this means is over the long run, equipment producers do not produce as much equipment because they simply realize it is unprofitable to them to do so. So new firms don't enter the market, thus reducing the scale of the competition. Many firms exit the market and new innovation on this equipment doesn't happen. The implication is simple. A lot of equipment production doesn't happen. Problem, MRI machines, fMRI machines, particle accelerators all depreciate over time. You need to build and buy new ones. If there are far fewer ones being built in the first place, then government allocation favors some labs while many labs literally don't get the research equipment in the first place to do a lot of research. This also preemptively reduces research funding because donors and private donors to research think you don't have the equipment to do research anymore, so they don't fund you, so research doesn't happen. Second, on political interference on the nature of research that happens. OG says governments will optimize for social value without explaining why governments will be good at optimizing for social value. Two reasons they won't. One, most equipment production happens overwhelmingly in the first world because it requires skilled labor. However, on our side, you still end up selling this equipment to poorer companies because some labs and big companies in poor countries do exist that have a ton of capital, like major industries like Reliance in India. However, the government of the US never wants to lease out this equipment to others. This is why we have trends like vaccine nationalism, where you want to keep keep your equipment for your own country. That means developing countries don't get research equipment, which is important because they use the research on problems that are unique to them. But second, what if the government decides it doesn't want a form of research? What if it doesn't want lab-grown meat, like Florida's recent ban on lab-grown meat? It can use research equipment as a lever to deny this research from happening, which is more effective than denying funding because at least you get some sort of private funding. This is a terrible idea we are very happy to oppose.
Thank you very much to the member of the opposition. I will remind everyone to please offer and take POIs throughout your speeches, and I'm happy to call upon the government whip.
Perfect. Cool. Let's be very clear on burdens. Whoever's right about Hadron Colliders and the particular organizational form that they take surrounding the conglomerate that owns them, if our side of the debate wanted to, we could nationalize a Hadron Collider or two. We could take the CERN organization and we could structure it the way that God wants to. There is fiat in the debate for that, even though O doesn't use it. We could also mandate all kinds of sharing agreements. If there are MRIs not being used in hospitals overnight, you could mandate that they share them and link them up to people who want to use them. The burden on Gov was to show why all things must be nationalized. They failed that burden. So I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to trace acquisition and production and explain why our analysis about the disincentive to produce equipment in the first place is more important. And then I'm going to talk about the transfer of this equipment and the inequalities that change in this debate. I'll begin by talking about the margin on this, actually, because I think it heavily affects opening government's comparative. The thing with this research, especially the more expensive research when you're talking about huge MRI machines that are extremely complex and customized, is it just seems awfully unlikely to us that even a government with Gov's incentives and their capabilities is moving this stuff all around. Like if you've got lots of Hadron Colliders in places or huge MRI machines, there are probably very large costs to transport this stuff, set it up somewhere else, and then bring in researchers who actually use it. So the actual margin of change on that transfer question is something that opening government didn't even fully prove to begin with before I get into that theme. But let's start with production and acquisition. So the critical link here that I think closing government doesn't respond to is that even if governments had some abstract incentives to create a good supply chain to manufacture MRIs and technical stuff, it's always going to make sense for them more in the short term to not have to allocate tons of money in this year's budget towards amping up the price of this thing. If you're a government, you want to drive down the prices. That's closing government's own mechanism. Even if the effect of driving those prices down is destructive in the long term, in the sense that if firms make this stuff at cost and you've driven down the price and shown that you're never going to pay a high price, then in the long run, you're disincentivizing innovation on this. And think about the kinds of firms who make this technology. Yes, it's medical technology firms, but it's not a natural law of physics that medical technology firms have to exist at their size. They make electronics, they can pivot into other industries, they can pivot into other secondary medical machinery that isn't high cost. So there are lots of other places for capital to go. It's not that capital is stuck, and the agreements that it has with governments aren't sufficiently long-term that it can't get out of contracts or simply change its behavior in the long run. So the critical thing is that capital leads. Even if you're giving them money, the question is, are you giving them money relative to the other places where their capital could have gone? And that is the burden that neither Gov team fulfills. But second, it actually costs the government money to buy this stuff, A, to literally do the nationalization and presumably compensate at cost some of this machinery, or I mean, you could just steal it, but that's going to drive away tons of investment too in the future. And then the second thing is it costs them lots of money, even if they pay low prices, to continue buying up that material. And that money has a trade-off, because that money is probably coming from the pool of capital that a government otherwise has to fund researchers and just give them money on experiments, both in the sciences, but in all kinds of other academic fields as well. So the additional burden on opening government here is proof that we're using this money in actively good ways, because we can use government funding for all kinds of things in sciences. We can give grants to up and coming researchers to come up with better, more efficient ideas for how we can allocate space on the Hadron Collider and what kinds of experiments we can do. And I think it was a bit naive for closing government here to say that, like, we don't know whether the Higgs boson is useful. It's kind of like speculative and long term. All due respect to the member of government, I would rather a panel of scientists and a funding agency in the status quo deliberate and make that decision than the closing government team. Because precisely Tejas' point is being made here. Things that seem speculative, that can't be defended in the article in The Atlantic, are the kinds of things that probably had their funding cut, because governments are, if accountability mechanisms work, likely to be partial to that kind of misleading argument from closing government rather than what's actually scientifically useful. You can be sure that scientists get upset about this, but that's probably not going to be sufficient. The thing with this stuff is it's so hard to observe the counterfactual, right? Like even if you make criticisms that say government should be allocating high-tech machinery in different ways, the average reader, even if they're like, I really care about this, has very little idea who to trust or what to do with that information. They don't know who to contact. The political pressure to make that a voting issue is extremely limited. And it's hard to show the harm, right? The harm is a harm by omission. It's we could have done this research. We didn't do that research, but people know all kinds of cutting edge research is happening. So how much do they make that a political priority is the question on the accountability claim. Both opening government and closing government don't answer that question effectively. Before I go on, I will take closing.
You're right, you don't have the ability to countermodel at CO. We have Hadron Colliders researching medicine, whereas yours look for particles that don't have weight in real life, let alone the debate.
Okay, the margin on this is actually really small. You, per opening government, have an independent panel of scientists. If you're a Hadron Collider scientist, you probably are inculcated into a culture of science that cares about the kinds of things that Hadron Colliders presently do, because when you were a kid, you thought about the Higgs boson or the things that particle colliders can do. Maybe there is some marginal degree of difference, but in our world, we got a private market. So presumably we're the ones with the commercial pressures, right? If it makes you a lot of money to use the Hadron Collider for medical application, then grants to that stuff equally should be getting a lot of approval because they can pay you a lot of money in order to accept the use of the Hadron Collider. So again, proving the margin there proves very tricky for closing government. Now, transfer and inequality. The government argument here is that we're going to reallocate this stuff to universities and places that need it more and presently don't have access. First, while it is unfortunate that researchers leave small universities and go to big labs, there are benefits to economies of scale. There are untraded interdependencies. There's information sharing. If you have the most brilliant physicists all working together at Stanford and Berkeley, they're probably going to come up with more talking to each other and publishing together and doing experiments together than they are dispersed all across the country. Second, if you put an MRI machine out in Wyoming, even if you're going to have a couple of star scientists who are motivated to stay there, it's probably not going to be used optimally. The amount of cases where it's being used 24/7 and tons of high-end research is done probably isn't the case. So there's still a large pressure for scientists to move. Second, we take advantage of private capital. The best projects often involve a combo of both government funding and private funding. If Stanford has a ton of these machines, then they're benefiting both from the government funding that they get via grants and also from private funding that they use to continue paying the best researchers and motivating them to do high-risk experiments that can create both scientific and also like commercializable medical innovations that come from this stuff. So we piggyback on a lot of existing funding and prestige that mean that we have a lot of good researchers working on this stuff, but also on international sharing. The argument here isn't that vaccine nationalism stops. The argument here is that governments very specifically look bad, if you believe any of the accountability stuff, sharing equipment during a pandemic with another country and using it for themselves is very politically optimal. Same thing on types of political pressure. We're not claiming that all kinds of political pressure go away. What we are claiming is that governments, when they want to prevent certain things from being done in science, can do it a lot more easily when they control the literal equipment, your ability to do it at all, versus when we get some private funding on our side. And that's the reason, by the way, why we very simply weigh over OO on this question. If you take away someone's equipment, they can't do the research. If there isn't equipment being built, and by the way, we didn't claim that microchips are cheap now, they'll get cheap in the future, that's the kind of stuff that we're trading off, then there's going to be a lot of minimal research. Maybe OO proves to an extent that the incentives change, but I think for the reasons that Gov demonstrates, there are lots of good incentives on both sides of the house. If you don't have the equipment, it's not cheap, and it's not distributed effectively, then you can't do the kinds of research that both sides value. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the opposition whip and to everyone for what was an excellent debate. Please leave the room so we can conduct the panel and be available so that you can come back as soon as we call you back and you can go to lunch on time.
Thanks for the debate, everyone.